The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, hello and good morning, folks. My name is Nick Cortina here with Exago. We're delivering a support lab today all about stored procedures, and we're very happy that you folks are all here to join us. And so, as usual, just to kick things off, if we could just post a yes or a Y or something to let us know that you can hear me in the questions box for me, that would be great. All right, and it looks like we're coming through okay. That is awesome. So today we're going to go through a bunch of stuff all about stored procedures. And really our goal for today is to help you folks understand when, how, and why you might elect to use a stored procedure, specifically relating to Exago reporting. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, first off, why are you going to use a stored procedure? We want to look at some pros and cons, some Exago use cases, when it's going to be good and when it's maybe not going to be as good, as well as some best practices there. We're going to take a look at some programmable object settings, which is a way within Exago to help us dictate to a stored procedure to either return just some schema information, a full data set, or maybe a filter dropdown. And then finally, we're going to take a look at a quick report execution demo, and we're going to compare and contrast doing a top N with a stored procedure versus doing the same top N, but just using the standard database tables. And we'll see some of the differences and the similarities there and sort of, explore that a little bit as well. So to kick things off, why might we use a stored procedure? What might cause us to say, yep, a stored procedure is what we want to use in this report? And first off, it might already be there. And what we mean by that is, as you get into reporting and say, hey, we've got Exago integrated, we're looking to start generating some reports, what's on our database for us to use to pull information, you might already have a well-formed stored procedure that does some complex calculations or something for you, and that's just going to be convenient, right? So if it's already there, why not use it? Furthermore, you might have a complex security model. You might have some things where you say, hey, we need to be able to handle some sort of various cases depending on which user's signing in or something complex like that. And we'll see that stored procedures are going to lend themselves to handle those types of situations fairly well. We can also perform modifications to one or more tables with a stored procedure. So this one's maybe not going to be as critical in terms of Exago because we're probably going to be reading information a little bit more frequently than we're doing any updating or writing. That being said, it is definitely worth mentioning that a stored procedure can perform some of these modifications where some other types of data objects might not be able to do that. Another thing to mention here is that a stored procedure can hold several statements, and these can be things like loops, if-else's, and really what I'm trying to get at here is that a well-formed stored procedure is going to read a little bit more like a programming language than it will a querying language. And the reason why it's kind of nice to know that is because with a stored procedure, we're going to be able to get at some complex calculations and things that might not be as easy to do with some other standard data objects. The final thing that we definitely want to touch on here is going to be performance, and this is probably one of the primary reasons we'll look at a stored procedure along with that security model discussion. And really the key things to think about performance here are that we can do things like offloading calculations from Exago to that given stored procedure. Again, I think we're going to see some of this later on with that top N demo. Another thing to mention here is that we can also do the filtering directly on the database. And so how does this tie to performance? Well, if we can filter directly on the database to mitigate the total number of rows being returned from the data source, that actually is just going to speed up the Exago reporting lifecycle because if there's less rows that Exago has to process, that means it's just going to be quicker for us to get to that final report output. So looking at some of these things, you might be saying, okay, well, that's great, but why won't I use a view here? Why might I pick a stored procedure instead of a view? And the first thing that I would say to that is views don't accept parameters. So while a view can be really useful in terms of displaying information a little bit differently from the underlying table, we're not going to be able to take input values to dictate what set of data is then returned later on. Additionally, views can't modify the underlying tables in the same manner that a stored procedure can. And again, this one maybe isn't as critical in terms of Exago, but if we do want to have some pieces where when certain reports are executed, there might be some sort of update statement or something there, that's not something we'll be able to handle with a view. Finally, views can only contain a single select query. So part of what makes a stored procedure so powerful and so unique is this concept of being able to do things like subselects directly in that stored procedure. In a view, we're not going to be able to get to some of those different pieces. So there's just going to be a few things that a stored procedure can do that a view's just not going to be able to do for us. So if those are some reasons why we might pick a stored procedure, what might some of the limitations be? What are some things that might make us say, okay, maybe a stored procedure is not going to be as great here? And really, the first item that we really want to harp on here is that we can't join a stored procedure to any other object in the database. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that the stored procedure can't be joined to the other objects in terms of Exago. What it does mean, however, is that that join is going to have to happen in the code in Exago. And in terms of the actual performance of the report that we're going to use there, if we have to perform that join in the code, it's going to be significantly less performant than if we could do that at the database level. Additionally, stored procedures can't be used as part of a larger query. And this kind of relates to the last point in that a stored procedure is really sort of meant to be kind of a black box. And what I mean by that is a stored procedure is supposed to be well-formed, created, and then sort of set aside and kind of be done with, right? We want to be calling a stored procedure to get some information, potentially be passing some things in, but we don't really want to be changing that stored procedure too much once we have it working in the manner that it's supposed to be for our report. So with those limitations and some of the benefits in mind, what might be some good use cases for stored procedures in Exago? The first one is really going to be any report where we only need to use one data object. If we have some standalone report that's going to execute by itself, and we don't have to join other objects to that first object, that's going to be a great time to use a stored procedure because we get to take advantage of all the things that, especially things like the performance benefits, some of the complex security and the filtering, without having to worry about any of those detriments we mentioned, the things like joining in the code and some of those other pieces. Additionally, if we need to do some filtering via the stored procedure and parameter passing, that's going to be another time where we might want to say, yeah, this could be a good use case for a stored procedure on this report. Finally, if we have a set of standard reports or maybe canned reports that we want to look at and sort of expose to our clients and our users, this might be another time where we could look to use stored procedures. And really the key here is if these reports are going to be things that we expose maybe as read only, as our set of 10 to 15 initial reports that we're letting a lot of users run and access frequently, but not update very often, not really change too much. They're going to be just sort of the standard set that anyone can run. Those might be good use cases, again, because we can take advantage of the performance benefits without having to worry about things like the detriments, again, primarily doing those joins in code. So if these are some good use cases, right, what are maybe some not so great use cases? What are some times where we're going to say, hey, maybe we don't want to use a stored procedure here? And if, a great use case is wherever we have a report with a single data object, anytime we need to access multiple data objects in the same report, it's probably not going to be a great choice to use a stored procedure here. Again, this relates directly back to that concept of having to do those joins in code. And I think, we've got a couple other items on the list here, but really the central point here is any time where there's going to have to be joins between the stored procedure and any other data object, we're going to see some performance detriments. So again, that's going to be things like drill downs. If we want to be able to drill from one report to the next and use different data objects where one or more of those data objects is a stored procedure, that's going to be a little bit of a performance hit because, again, we have to do those joins in code and it's going to be a little more complex. Additionally, we're going to need to do just a little bit more work to make sure that all of the relationships between parent and child report are set up correctly there. Furthermore, That same concept is kind of going to tie into dashboards a little bit here too. And really the initial use case that I'm thinking of here is if we have two separate reports, one that uses a stored procedure and one that uses either your views or your tables, whatever the case might be, you might want to have a filter that controls both those reports on your dashboard. And you can see that right there, we're going to get to this point where it's going to get a little more complex in terms of making sure that relationship is adequately defined, again, via joins in your admin console. And even further than that complexity we're talking about, there's still going to be that recurring theme of this performance hit. So with some of these things in mind, there's a couple best practices that we really want to touch on here to ensure that, if we find a good use case for a stored procedure, we make sure that we go about implementing it the right way to take advantage of all the things we have in Exago here. And so the first real key is that we want to make sure we set column metadata for every stored procedure we add. And then additionally, we modify our schema access type to be metadata. And what this will do for us is it mitigates the total number of calls to the stored procedure in general by saying whenever I need to go get just the schema information, get it from the metadata instead of going and hitting the data source again. Another thing that we can do is implement our programmable object settings. And we'll see in just a second that these allow us to dictate what set of information the stored procedure actually returns. This again is going to tie into the concept of being able to pass parameters from Exago to that stored procedure, but we'll see exactly how this works in just a few minutes here. The final best practice here is going to be sort of more if you find yourself using a lot of stored procedures and you say, hey, we'd really like to sort of use stored procedures a little more across the board on a larger scale. And what we might recommend in that type of instance is instead of just utilizing the stored procedures in your data source, implement a third layer between your given data source and Exago in the form of a data warehouse, and use those stored procedures to push information into the centralized data warehouse, which you can then connect to from Exago to go get information for reporting. Some considerations there, if we do choose to go this type of route, we might want to also look at implementing some data triggers in terms of combating that data latency, right? Obviously, if we have to push information from one data source to a central data warehouse, we'd like to make sure that that's happening often enough so that the data we view when we go to create reports is going to be nice and fresh. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and start talking a little bit about some of those programmable object settings and seeing exactly how some of those things are going to help us out in Exago. But before we do jump into that, I just want to pause for just a minute and make sure that there's no questions or anything. So if anyone's got anything there, feel free to post those and we'll make sure that we're all good. Okay, and it looks like we're doing okay for now. We do have a couple folks answering questions for us here. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I want to open up Notepad++ here. And to describe exactly what we're looking at right now to you folks, we frequently rely on using the Northwind dataset here. And so for those of you who are familiar and for those of you who aren't, there's one table called the orders table. And in terms of Northwind, this is a fairly standard table. We've got some order information, things like order IDs, things of that nature. And what I've gone and done here is in my local database, I've actually created a stored procedure that's really sort of identical to that actual table for the orders. But to take it one step further, I went ahead and implemented those programmable object settings that I referenced earlier in the slide deck. And so just to give you guys the scope of exactly what we're doing here with the stored procedure, we can see that before anything else, we're going to pass in a bunch of these different parameter values. And in just a moment, we'll see exactly how these are actually getting assigned from Exago. Now, as we go down, we can see if we take the call type parameter, which is really going to be the most important, I would say, of these programmable object settings. Setting that call type here and saying if the call type is equal to 0 is just going to go and get that schema information for us here. If the call type is set to 1, we can see that we're actually going to go and get that full data set back. And then finally, if our call type is set to 2, we're going to return a truncated list for a filter dropdown. And you might be saying, okay, and that's great, but where exactly are these parameters coming from? And to that, I want to just jump into my admin console for you folks here. And we're taking a look at some of our general settings, specifically these programmable object settings. And so here, what we can see is that for each one of these programmable object settings, we can actually assign a name that's going to go along with that specific parameter. Now, the interesting piece here is, after I've given each of these specific parameters a name, I can then reference those parameters in my stored procedure. And just for clarity here, what I'm going to do is actually just open this guy up so we can see these at the same time. So if we look here, right, we can see this call type parameter, is going to be displayed right here for us. And the real interesting piece here, and part of what makes these so powerful in terms of Exago, is that just by assigning a name to the call type parameter, it's going to assign a value automatically whenever I go to get schema information, whenever I query the full data set, whenever I click a filter dropdown. And with each of those 3 things that I just mentioned happens, the appropriate value for call type is going to be passed in. And because we've defined our procedure to utilize that call type to dictate what gets returned, we can effectively say, hey, Exago told us that it's looking for schema, let's just give us schema information. And we can do the same for saying, hey, it needs the full data set, give it the full data set. It needs a truncated list for a filter, give it a truncated list for a filter. Again, really the most critical of these parameters is going to be call type, but all of these programmable object settings are very useful and can help dictate what exactly that stored procedure is going to return back when we go to actually access that object. Just to kind of keep everybody in the loop here, we do have a great article in terms of the programmable object settings on our support site here I wanted to point out for you folks. So if we do want more specific information about what each of these values is actually going to look like so that we can define our stored procedure accurately, we would definitely recommend using this as a resource there. If we take a look at Exago here, right, one of the other things I want to highlight is we were looking at that stored procedure for the orders table. And something that we might want to think about is, well, hey, when a user logs in and they're going to actually use one of these data objects, one of these stored procedures that we might expose, how is that process going to differ, if at all, from how they might access a report using something like the standard tables or views or something like that? And I think the easiest way for me to convey this is just to sort of show you folks. So if we go ahead and open up a new Express view here, and we take a look at the given data objects that I have access to on the left-hand side. First, we can see this orders table. Now, this is the standard table that comes in the Northwind dataset, and that's fine. But one other thing I've actually added is this SP orders. Now, this is that stored procedure that I was just showing you folks, and it's got those programmable objects configured within it as well. Now, the interesting thing here is I've chosen to alias this with SP_orders to make it clear to you folks viewing this today that this is a stored procedure. That being said, the beauty of this object is that as we click the dropdown, you'll see that the actual fields that we have access to aren't going to appear any differently from those exposed from a given table. So in terms of the end user experience, part of the beauty of these programmable objects is that we can go ahead and do these things and implement these pieces to make our stored procedures run faster and have these significant performance benefits. And in terms of the end user experience, they're not going to have any idea that they're accessing a table versus a stored procedure. And again, this says SP orders. If I were to navigate over to my admin console for just a moment, if I were to take a look at that actual procedure that I've got here, we can see that the alias is actually just SP orders, and I could set this to be whatever I want, again, for the purpose of this example, I just wanted it to be really clear which one was the stored procedure and which is just the standard table. So again, I want to pause for just a moment and just make sure that we're doing okay with questions. Awesome, and it looks like we're doing great. Seems like our folks entering questions are really on top of things, which is awesome. And so at this point, the next thing that I'd like to do is compare and contrast doing a report execution using standard tables to get a top N value, and then doing the same thing but just using a stored procedure instead. So to kick things off, let's go ahead and take a look. I'm going to navigate back into my Exago here. And if I drill down into this lab content folder, we'll see I've created a couple of reports for this lab. And what I think I first want to do is just take a quick look at this top N report that I've created. And looking at the data objects that I have here on the left-hand side, we can see that this is actually just going to be using a couple of tables from the Northwind dataset. So what goes into making this top N report using the tables? Well, first things first, we had to add 3 separate data objects to ensure that we have access to all the information we need. Second, in order to calculate something like the revenue total for each employee, we need to first add a sort on that employee last name so that we can go ahead and group by it. We then need to add a formula in that grouping on an ag sum of the revenue. And, just for adding some other calculations here, I've also counted the number of orders for each employee. Again, just going to be another formula here. And the last thing that we have to do here is in our filters menu, navigating to the top bottom section, we have to first turn on the top N filtering and then assign the total number of, top N values that we'd like to see. Again, there's going to be a couple other steps like adding the chart, doing some simple formatting and things of that nature. But in terms of some of the key steps to get our top N values, that's going to be it, right? So if we execute this report, we'll go ahead and see the top 5 employees ordered by their total revenue. And that's great. That definitely is getting us where we need to be. But how is this going to compare and contrast with doing the same thing but using a stored procedure? So what I'll do here is let's just navigate back to our report tree. And this time I want to take a look at the same report, except this report is using a stored procedure instead of those 3 tables. So first off, in terms of the user experience, I only have to add 1 data object to this report instead of 3. And up until now, we've been talking about our data objects sort of specifically, I might say, right? In that, some are stored procedures, some are tables, some are views, etc. But here, from the end user experience, it's not, do I add 1 stored procedure, do I add 3 tables? It's, do I add 1 object or do I add 3 objects? And so here we can see this user only has to add 1. Furthermore, you'll notice that some of these values I'm displaying here are actually only being shown in a detail section. Now, before, in the top end using the tables, we had to add a sort and then a grouping so we could do a calculation to get the total revenue and the number of orders. Interestingly enough, this stored procedure does that calculation at the data source level. Meaning, by the time the information comes back to Exago, we've already summed the revenue and we've already counted the orders. To take it a step further, if we take a look at the sorts on this report, we'll see that there actually aren't any. I've actually gone ahead and in my stored procedure to do the top end calculation, I've added a clause that sorts the information before it gets to Exago. Again, just further offloading some of those pieces so that Exago is going to be able to surface this a little bit quicker. The last interesting piece I've done here is you'll notice that when I execute this report, we're actually going to get a prompting parameter that says, hey, how many employees do you want to see? So before, we had to set that value of 5 in the base report, and that was sort of it. But with the stored procedure, we can set this parameter value to prompt us to ask for how many is the top n actually going to be. So since we can change it, let's show the top 6 instead of the top 5. And again, we can see this one is pretty performant. The Northwind dataset's going to be a little too small for us to really see the big differences in terms of the differences of performance there. But really, even just in terms of the user experience of building this report, having one data object is going to make things a little bit simpler. And we even didn't have to add some things like that ag sum formula for the revenue and the ag count of the number of orders. We were able to just show fields that say revenue and number of orders. So what exactly is different about this stored procedure in terms of the data object that we're using? Well, to sort of show that, I'm going to go back to my Notepad++ here for just a second. And this is that actual top n procedure that we're using in order to get the information here. So some of the key things that I really want to highlight for you folks are, one, we can do the sum as rev and count as num orders. And these are going to be that total revenue for each employee as well as a count of the number of orders. We're grouping by that last name from the employee table, which is helping to generate these values once for each employee. You can see we've got some of the associated joins in the procedure directly here. And then finally, we're going to do this order by that revenue calculation, and setting this to be descending means that the higher order revenue values come first. One of the things that you may have noticed that I didn't touch on just yet is going to be this n vals. And this is actually a parameter value, and this is the value that we're setting when that parameter pops up on the screen to say number of employees, question mark. And this value has a sort of default value of 3 here, but anytime I assign the parameter value in Exago, it's going to overwrite this value when it calls the procedure. So at this point, let's take a look at my admin console just to see exactly how we implemented this procedure. If I go back to the admin console, we can see I've got this top salesman. And looking here, we can see that after selecting my Northwind source, clicking the dropdown, my procedures are going to show up in this little category for me. After selecting the top salesman here, we can go and alias that given object, so I've chosen to call it top sales. We can define a unique key field. In this case, I'm using last name because I know I'm only displaying, I believe it's 8 rows for each of the Northwind employees. And then finally, what we've got here is this parameter called nvals. And this parameter, if I navigate to my parameters here, is set as name nvals. It's a type integer. I've set a default value here in Exago, and if we recall, when I initially ran that report, this 5, this default value is what was in that dropdown. I've set hidden to be false so that we can use it as a prompting parameter. And by setting this prompt text, it ensures that whenever I need to use this parameter, it'll prompt the user for a value first. After the parameter has been set, going back to the object, we can see that here, I can specify whichever parameters I'd like to actually pass to this stored procedure. Finally, we can see that in the metadata, I've gone ahead and aliased my objects because, some of these things might be intuitive, but rev, I think we should probably display that as revenue. And so you can see we've done that with the aliases here. And the last thing we've done, and we touched on this earlier, but just to make sure we sort of show exactly where we would do some of these things, we've set our schema access type to be metadata. And what this means is instead of, again, going to the data source to get some of that schema information, we're just going to go right to our metadata here instead. So at this point, we're coming just about to the end of the lab here. So I do just want to pause and make sure that if there are any other questions that you folks have a chance to throw those into the chat so we can address them as needed. And the other thing I do just want to make sure we mention is next month on the 7th, we're going to have another lab all about the mapping features and capabilities within Exago. So be sure to come back then and come in and see some great stuff about mapping there. So we had a question come in, can you add a drilled report to the chart and will it work with the procedure? And that's a great question. So I want to just jump back to Exago for just a minute, right? And really the key here is that this is going to tie back to one of those concepts that I'm reiterated on a lot, and I think it's important that we make sure we convey this. Anytime that we want to relate two things together and having the ability to drill down is going to be one of those times. If we want to drill to another report that uses the same stored procedure as its only data object, that might not be as bad because the relationship is already going to be there, right? Object to itself should be fairly straightforward. That being said, if we were to go from a stored procedure and drill down to another report that uses a different set of objects, then we're going to have to consider that we need to make sure all the appropriate joins are set up adequately in the admin console. That being said, while we still will be able to get there and make it work, it's going to be significantly less performant than if we use just normal views, tables in the parent report as well as in the child. We had another question come in. Can we execute stored procedures in custom SQL objects with parameters? And to that, I would say that in terms of the custom SQL object there, you're really going to want to use a custom SQL object if you're looking to sort of emulate using a stored procedure, but you don't want to touch the underlying database. Now, that being said, our custom SQL objects can be, and I apologize, I butcher this word, can be parameterized. And so that means that we can use them in a very similar manner to our stored procedures. So I would say that you're probably not going to use a stored procedure in conjunction with a custom SQL object. You're really going to, generally speaking, use one or the other. Another question coming kind of related to the same thing, so I think we'll address this. What is the difference between using a stored procedure using a custom SQL object? Using a custom SQL object means that that SQL is going to be stored all in Exago, and that information isn't going to be submitted to the data source until we actually query that object. Now, a stored procedure is going to be a little different there, in that the procedure lives on the database itself. And what that means is if there's some things like caching mechanisms in terms of, some of the different parts of the querying there, the database might have some things to help speed up that stored procedure. And again, that's going to be database specific. So each database might have some more or less things depending on what you're actually using. But really the key difference is the stored procedure lives on the database itself and is going to be able to take advantage of some more of the database specific features that will help performance, whereas a custom SQL object isn't going to be able to take advantage of as many of those pieces. That being said, if you don't want to change anything on your database, the custom SQL object is a great way to go because you're not modifying any of the underlying pieces there. Another question, can you add this to a dashboard and will it run without performance issues? And really the answer here is it kind of is going to depend. And I alluded to this just a little bit earlier, but really the key concept here is that wherever we've got a stored procedure on a report, if we want to be able to do things like drill from one report to the next, or we want multiple reports to be controlled by one central filter or things like that, those are instances where we're going to have to be careful in exactly what's sort of connected to what. Anytime the stored procedure has to be able to relate its information to some other report with other data objects, that's going to be a performance detriment. My general recommendation here is that if you're going to be building a dashboard, take a look at all the various pieces and sort of just map out the connections to yourself and say, hey, which of these pieces are going to be connected? Which of these pieces are just going to be a simple report execution that's actually sitting alongside all this other stuff? If all of your dashboard pieces aren't going to be connected in that manner, then using the stored procedures isn't going to be a big deal and could actually have some performance benefits for you there. That being said, if you want to do things like drill downs, if you want to have multiple reports controlled by the same filter, things like that, that's where you're going to want to take a step back and make sure that, hey, is this really the right time to be using a stored procedure? Uh, okay. Okay, so I think it looks like we're doing okay with the questions. If anything else does come in, we'll follow up after the webinar. But again, thank you folks so much for joining us today. We hope you learned something about stored procedures and how they work with Exago. And once again, be sure to join us on February 7th to learn more about mapping. Thanks again, folks, and happy reporting.